June 27, 1944. A narrow, sunken lane south of Rauray, Normandy. Lieutenant Klaus Beermann adjusted his field glasses through the commander's cupola of his Panzer IV OSF G, scanning the hedgerow 200 meters ahead. The morning fog had burned off, revealing shadows moving behind the dense bocage American armor, almost certainly Sherman's. His gunner, Unteroffizier Werner Stolz, had already traversed the turret, the long 75mm KRK-40 gun pointed toward the gap in the hedgerow where enemy tanks would have to emerge. Everything about this engagement followed the pattern Beermann had learned at the Panzertruppenschule training facility at Münster. Engage at range, fire the first shot, exploit superior German optics and the penetrating power of the high-velocity gun. Within 3 minutes, Beermann's confidence would transform into confusion, then alarm, as his crew discovered that the mathematics of tank combat they had internalized no longer applied. The Sherman appeared exactly where Beermann expected, its boxy silhouette unmistakable even in the dappled morning light. Stolz fired. The armor-piercing round struck the Sherman's glacis plate at a steep angle and ricocheted skyward with a bright flash. Before Beermann could issue orders for a second shot, the American tank fired, then fired again. In the space of 15 seconds, the Sherman's 75mm gun sent 4 rounds toward Beermann's position, 2 missing narrowly, one striking the Panzer's track assembly, another punching through the frontal armor just below the gun mantlet. The crew barely had time to register what was happening before the loader called for more ammunition, fumbling with the next round while smoke filled the fighting compartment. Beermann would survive that morning, bailing out seconds before his tank erupted in flames, but he would spend the remainder of the war trying to reconcile what he had witnessed with everything German doctrine had taught him about American industrial capabilities and combat effectiveness. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The disparity Beermann encountered was not accidental. It represented a fundamental difference in design philosophy, manufacturing capability, and tactical doctrine that German tank crews had not anticipated when they first engaged Allied armor in Normandy. The M4 Sherman 75mm M3 gun, mounted in the M34 gun mount, incorporated an automatic breech-loading mechanism derived from French field artillery designs dating to World War I. When the gun fired, the breech opened automatically, ejecting the spent shell casing. The loader merely had to grab a round from the ready rack, shove it into the breech, and step back. The breech closed automatically. The gunner could fire again within 3 to 5 seconds if the target remained in sight. This system, combined with the ergonomic layout of the Sherman's turret and the positioning of ammunition racks, allowed a trained crew to maintain a sustained rate of fire between 12 and 20 rounds per minute, far exceeding what German tankers believed American equipment could achieve. German intelligence assessments before the Normandy campaign had focused primarily on the Sherman's thin armor and modest gun penetration values. Reports from North Africa and Italy confirmed that the M4's 75mm gun struggled against up-armored Panzer IV variants and was effectively useless against the frontal armor of Tiger and Panther tanks. Waffenamt testing in 1943 estimated that the Sherman's M61 armor-piercing round could penetrate approximately 81mm of rolled homogeneous armor at 500 yards, adequate against early Panzer III and IV models, but increasingly obsolete as German armor improved. What these assessments failed to adequately consider was the Sherman's mechanical reliability, ease of operation, and most critically, its ability to place multiple rounds on target before German crews could reload and fire a second time. This oversight would prove catastrophic for German tank crews who had built their tactical doctrine around the assumption of qualitative superiority, compensating for numerical inferiority. The German approach to tank warfare emphasized precision, range, and first-shot kills. Crews trained extensively in range estimation, using the excellent Zeiss optics installed in German tanks to engage targets at distances where American and British guns struggled to penetrate. The doctrine assumed that superior German engineering, longer gun barrels, higher muzzle velocities, better armor protection would allow German tanks to destroy enemy armor before the enemy could close to effective range. This worked admirably against Soviet T-34 seconds and KV-1 second on the Eastern Front, where vast open spaces allowed German tanks to exploit their range advantages. It worked less well in the close terrain of Normandy's Bocage country, where engagement distances rarely exceeded 300 meters, and where the Sherman's rapid rate of fire became a decisive advantage. German crews found themselves in situations where they could fire once, perhaps twice, before American tanks had already placed 4 or 5 rounds in their direction, saturating the killing zone with high explosive and armor-piercing projectiles. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. German tank commanders had entered the war believing that German equipment represented the pinnacle of military engineering. The early victories in Poland, France, and the initial campaigns in Russia seemed to confirm this belief. Even when confronted with superior Soviet designs like the T-34, German crews learned to compensate through superior tactics and crew training. But the Sherman presented a different challenge. It was not necessarily better in any single measurable category, armor, gunpowder, speed, but it was better as a system. American industrial design had optimized every aspect of the Sherman for sustained combat operations. Mechanical reliability that kept it in the field longer than German tanks, ergonomic crew layout that reduced fatigue and increased efficiency, logistical simplicity that allowed rapid repair and replacement, and a fire control system that enabled trained crews to put more rounds on target in less time. German tankers who survived encounters with Shermans in Normandy reported a disturbing realization. They were not fighting tanks. They were fighting an industrial system that could absorb losses, adapt tactics, and maintain pressure regardless of German technical superiority. The German Panzer IV, which formed the backbone of German armoured forces in Normandy, required approximately 8 to 12 seconds between shots under combat conditions. The loader had to manually extract the spent casing, stow it, grab a new round from the ammunition bins mounted along the hull walls, lift the heavy shell, guide it into the breech, and close the breech manually. The gunner then had to reacquire the target, adjust aim, and fire. This process, while efficient by the standards of early war German design, could not match the Sherman's automatic breech system. Even the Tiger and Panther tanks, with their fearsome 88mm and 75mm guns respectively, suffered from reload times that exceeded the Sherman's capability. The Tiger's massive rounds were cumbersome, the Panther's side-loading ammunition arrangement was awkward, and both tanks required manual breech operation. In a close-range engagement where both tanks fired simultaneously, the Sherman crew could often get 3 shots off before the German crew completed their second reload. This was the reality that Lieutenant Behrmann and thousands of German tank crews discovered in the hedgerows of Normandy. The Americans were not supposed to have this capability. Intelligence briefs had assured them that American tanks were inferior, that German training and equipment would prevail. But as Behrmann watched his burning Panzer IV from the relative safety of a roadside ditch, he understood that the war had changed in ways German doctrine had failed to anticipate. The Shermans kept firing, their guns cycling with mechanical precision, placing round after round into German positions with a speed that seemed impossible. The Americans did not need to penetrate frontal armor on the first shot. They could miss twice and still have time for a third attempt before German crews could respond. This was not the tank war German commanders had planned for. This was industrial warfare, where volume of fire and mechanical reliability trumped individual technical superiority. And, as Behrmann would learn in the weeks ahead, this was a war Germany was not equipped to win. The German understanding of armoured warfare in 1944 rested on a foundation built during the interwar years and refined through 7 years of combat experience. That foundation emphasized mobility, combined arms operations, and the decisive application of armoured force at critical points. Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armoured doctrine, had written extensively about the importance of concentration and shock action. His 1937 book, Achtung Panzer, outlined principles that guided German tank development and tactical employment through the early war years. Tanks were not merely infantry support vehicles. They were breakthrough weapons designed to penetrate enemy lines, disrupt rear areas, and create opportunities for exploitation. This doctrine worked brilliantly in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in the Soviet Union, where German armor achieved operational success through speed, coordination, and the shock effect of massed tank formations. By 1944, however, this doctrine confronted a new reality. Germany found itself on the strategic defensive, its industrial capacity stretched thin, its manpower reserves diminishing, and its enemies possessing numerical superiority in virtually every category of military equipment. German tank development had evolved to emphasize heavy armor and powerful guns as compensating factors for numerical inferiority. The Tiger I, introduced in late 1942, mounted an 88mm gun derived from the famous Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun. This weapon could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers, and the Tiger's frontal armor was effectively impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons. The Panther, rushed into production after the shock of encountering Soviet T-34 seconds on the Eastern Front, combined excellent armor protection with a high-velocity 75mm gun capable of engaging targets at extreme range. These tanks represented the German solution to being outnumbered. Build tanks so superior that a single German tank could engage and destroy multiple enemy vehicles before those vehicles could close to effective range. This solution worked well in certain contexts. On the open terrain of the Eastern Front, where sight lines extended for kilometers, German heavy tanks devastated Soviet armor formations. Tiger and Panther tanks positioned in defensive positions could engage advancing Soviet T-34 seconds at distances where the Soviet guns were ineffective, methodically destroying tank after tank as Soviet formations advanced across open ground. The kill-to-loss ratios achieved by German heavy tank battalions on the Eastern Front were extraordinary individual. Tiger tanks claimed dozens of enemy vehicles destroyed. Kurt Knispel, the highest-scoring tank ace of the war, was credited with 168 confirmed kills, most achieved in Tiger tanks on the Eastern Front. These successes reinforced the German belief that qualitative superiority could compensate for quantitative inferiority. Better training, better equipment, better tactics, these factors would allow Germany to continue fighting effectively, even as the material balance shifted against them. But Normandy was not the Eastern Front. The Bocage country of northwestern France consisted of small fields enclosed by ancient earthen banks topped with dense hedgerows. These natural obstacles, some dating back centuries, created a labyrinth of narrow lanes and small clearings, where visibility rarely exceeded a few hundred meters. Tanks could not maneuver off-road without risk of bogging down or becoming entangled in vegetation. Movement was channelized along predictable routes, allowing defenders to prepare ambush positions. The terrain negated many of the advantages German heavy tanks possessed. Range was irrelevant when you could not see beyond the next hedgerow. The Tiger's powerful gun was of little use when American tanks appeared suddenly at point-blank range from behind dense vegetation. German tank crews trained to engage at long range found themselves in knife-fighting distance with American armor, where the Sherman's advantages in rate of fire, turret traverse speed, and mechanical reliability became decisive. German intelligence had tracked American tank development throughout the war. They knew the Sherman was the standard American medium tank, produced in vast numbers at multiple factories across the United States. They knew it was mechanically reliable, easy to maintain, and adequately armed for infantry support missions. They knew its armor was thin by German standards. Frontal hull armor ranged from 51 to 63 mm depending on variant, compared to 80 mm or more on late-model Panzer IVs and up to 150 mm on Tiger tanks. They knew the 75mm gun struggled against German heavy armor. What they did not adequately appreciate was how American industrial design had optimized the Sherman for sustained combat operations in ways that transcended simple measurements of armor, thickness, and gun penetration. The Sherman's design reflected American manufacturing philosophy and combat doctrine. Unlike German tanks, which were often hand-built with close tolerances and complex mechanical systems, the Sherman was designed for mass production. Parts were standardized and interchangeable, Assembly line techniques allowed multiple manufacturers to produce Shermans and their components. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 49,000 Sherman tanks across multiple variants. This production volume was inconceivable to German planners, whose own tank production was constrained by material shortages, labor limitations, and the complexity of German designs. A Tiger tank required approximately 300,000 man-hours to build. A Sherman required less than 10,000. This difference meant that for every Tiger produced, American factories could build 30 Shermans. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side that could replace losses quickly and maintain numerical superiority, regardless of individual tank performance. The Sherman's internal layout reflected American emphasis on crew efficiency and survivability. The 5-man crew commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, who also served as hull machine gunner, worked in a relatively spacious fighting compartment compared to German tanks. The commander had an excellent cupola with periscopes, providing 360-degree visibility. The gunner sat to the commander's left, with access to a gyroscopic stabilization system that allowed reasonably accurate fire while moving something no German tank possessed. The loader worked on the commander's right, with ammunition readily accessible in racks mounted along the turret, a basket. Ready rounds were positioned for easy access, allowing the loader to maintain rapid fire without having to reach into awkward storage locations. This ergonomic design reduced crew fatigue and increased combat effectiveness during sustained engagements. American tank doctrine emphasized flexibility and combined arms coordination rather than tank-on-tank dueling. Shermans were designed to support infantry advances, destroy fortifications, engage anti-tank guns, and yes, fight enemy tanks when necessary. But unlike German doctrine, which increasingly relied on tanks to serve as the primary counter to enemy armor, American doctrine treated tanks as part of an integrated system. Artillery would suppress enemy positions, infantry would protect tanks from close-range anti-tank weapons, tank destroyers would engage enemy armor, and fighter bombers would attack targets beyond the immediate battle area. The Sherman did not need to win one-on-one engagements with German heavy tanks, because American tactics rarely allowed such engagements to occur. When Shermans did encounter German armor, they often had numerical superiority, artillery support, and air cover advantages that German intelligence assessments had noted but underestimated in their analysis of tank versus tank combat capability. The 75mm M3 gun mounted in the Sherman was itself a product of American industrial pragmatism. Derived from the French 75mm field gun that had served with distinction in World War I, the American version was adapted for tank use with an automatic breech mechanism and improved ammunition. The gun fired several types of ammunition: M72 armor-piercing shot, M61 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap rounds, M48 high-explosive shells, and M89 smoke rounds. The high-explosive round proved particularly effective in Normandy, where much of the fighting involved engaging German infantry positions, anti-tank guns, and fortifications rather than enemy tanks. The M48 shell contained 1.5 pounds of TNT and was devastating against soft targets. British tank crews, impressed by the M3's dual-purpose capability, actually bored out their own 6-pounder guns to fire American 75mm ammunition, creating the Ordnance QF 75mm gun that equipped Churchill and Cromwell tanks in Normandy. German tankers knew all of this, at least in theory. Intelligence summaries provided detailed specifications on Sherman variants, ammunition types, and tactical employment. What the summaries could not adequately convey was the cumulative effect of American advantages in a sustained campaign. One Sherman might be inferior to one Tiger, but 30 Shermans supported by artillery, air power, and abundant supplies of fuel and ammunition represented a combat system that German forces could not match. German tanks in Normandy operated under severe constraints. Fuel shortages limited movement. Spare parts were scarce. Allied air superiority meant that German tanks could not move during daylight without risk of attack. Replacement tanks and crews were increasingly difficult to obtain, as Germany's industrial capacity was devastated by strategic bombing and the demands of the Eastern Front. Each German tank lost was a significant blow, each Sherman destroyed was quickly replaced. This was the battlefield reality that awaited German tank crews in Normandy. They had trained for a different war-mobile warfare on open terrain, where German technical superiority and tactical skill would prevail. Instead, they found themselves fighting a grinding attritional battle in close terrain against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority and the industrial capacity to sustain losses indefinitely. The Sherman's rapid rate of fire was merely one aspect of this larger systemic advantage, but it was an aspect that German crews encountered directly and personally in every engagement. And, as Lieutenant Bearman had discovered on that foggy morning near Rauray, it was an aspect that German doctrine had failed to adequately prepare them for. The Americans were not supposed to fight this way, their tanks were not supposed to be this effective. But here, in the hedgerows of Normandy, the reality of industrial warfare was asserting itself with brutal clarity. The foundation of German expectations about American armor capability rested on observations from earlier campaigns. When American tanks first engaged German forces in North Africa in 1942, German commanders had been unimpressed. The M3 Grant, with its hull-mounted 75mm gun and awkward sponson design, was clearly inferior to contemporary German designs. Even the early M4 Shermans that arrived in North Africa demonstrated weaknesses, thin armor, modest gun penetration, and a tendency to catch fire when penetrated. German after-action reports from Tunisia noted these deficiencies and concluded that American armor, while present in large numbers, did not pose the kind of qualitative threat that Soviet T-34 seconds represented on the Eastern Front. This assessment, reasonable given the evidence available in 1942 and 43, would prove catastrophically incomplete by the time American armor landed in Normandy. What German intelligence failed to appreciate was the American capacity for industrial learning and rapid improvement. Between the North African campaign and the Normandy invasion, American tank development had not remained static. The Sherman's wet stowage ammunition system, implemented in 1944, dramatically reduced the tank's vulnerability to catastrophic fire. Ammunition was stored in water-jacketed containers under the turret floor, with glycerin mixed into the water to prevent freezing. When the tank was penetrated, the water would flood the ammunition compartment, preventing detonation. This modification, combined with improved crew training and better tactical employment, addressed one of the Sherman's most serious vulnerabilities, though German intelligence did not learn of these improvements until Normandy combat revealed them. The American training system also evolved significantly between North Africa and Normandy. Tank crews arriving in France in 1944 had benefited from extensive training at facilities like Fort Knox, where realistic combat scenarios and lessons learned from earlier campaigns informed instruction. Crews practiced crew coordination, gunnery, and maintenance until these tasks became second nature. The emphasis was on teamwork and efficiency, rather than individual heroism. A Sherman crew functioned as an integrated unit where each member's role was clearly defined and practiced to the point of automaticity. This training philosophy stood in stark contrast to late-war German tank crew preparation, where fuel shortages and time constraints meant that many crews arrived at the front with minimal training on their assigned vehicles. German tankers in Normandy represented a mix of experienced veterans and hastily trained replacements. The veterans, many with years of combat experience on the Eastern Front, brought tactical skills and situational awareness that newer crews lacked. But even these veterans found themselves disoriented by the bocage fighting. Tank combat on the Eastern Front had accustomed them to certain patterns, long sight lines, mobile battles, opportunities to exploit superior German optics and gun range. The close-range, ambush-style fighting in Normandy violated these expectations. Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, the famous SS tank ace with over 100 kills to his credit, was killed near Caen in August 1944 when his Tiger tank was caught in close terrain by multiple British Shermans and was destroyed. Accounts vary, but the engagement occurred at ranges where the Tiger's advantages were negated and numerical superiority proved decisive. The Panzer IV crews, like Lieutenant Bearman's, faced particular challenges. The Panzer IV had evolved significantly during the war, Early models mounted a short-barreled 75mm gun designed for infantry support. Later versions, beginning with the OSF F2 in 1942, received the longer KAK 40L, 43, and then L 48 guns capable of defeating most Allied tanks at normal combat ranges. Frontal armor was increased to 80mm, and additional armor plates were welded or bolted onto vulnerable areas. These improvements made the Panzer IV a formidable opponent, but they also increased weight, reducing mobility and reliability. The tank that entered service as a fast, reliable medium tank had become a sluggish vehicle prone to mechanical problems and transmission failures. German crews joked grimly that they needed 2 Panzer IVs on every mission, one to tow the other when it broke down. The Tiger and Panther tanks, while more powerful, brought their own problems. The Tiger weighed 57 tons, requiring enormous amounts of fuel to operate and placing tremendous stress on the transmission and suspension. The overlapping road wheel design, while distributing weight effectively, was prone to jamming with mud and ice. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces learned to attack at dawn when frozen mud locked the Tiger's road wheels in place. The Panther, rushed into production after encountering T-34 seconds at Kursk, suffered from reliability problems that plagued it throughout the war. Early Panthers frequently caught fire due to engine problems. The final drive, the mechanism that transmitted power from the transmission to the tracks, was chronically weak, failing after only a few hundred kilometers of operation. German tankers in Normandy often found themselves fighting in vehicles that were mechanically unreliable, impossible to adequately maintain given fuel and spare parts shortages, and increasingly difficult to keep but operational as the campaign progressed. American tank crews, meanwhile, benefited from a logistical system that German forces could only envy. The Sherman's mechanical reliability meant that it spent more time operational than in repair. When maintenance was needed, abundant spare parts and specialized repair units ensured quick turnaround. American armored divisions included integral maintenance battalions with mobile repair shops capable of conducting major overhauls in the field. Damaged Shermans were recovered from the battlefield, repaired if possible, or cannibalized for parts if beyond economical repair. This system meant that American tank units maintained higher operational readiness rates than their German counterparts, translating into sustained combat power over extended periods. The ammunition situation further favored American forces. A Sherman carried between 75 and 90 rounds of 75mm ammunition, depending on variant and ammunition type. German tanks typically carried fewer rounds due to space constraints and the larger size of German ammunition. More importantly, American logistics ensured that ammunition was always available. Tank units could resupply quickly, often receiving fresh ammunition within hours of requesting it. German units in Normandy, by contrast, struggled with chronic ammunition shortages. Resupply convoys were vulnerable to Allied air attack, and the limited rail and road network made distribution difficult. German tank crews sometimes had to carefully ration ammunition, avoiding engagement unless absolutely necessary, a significant psychological burden when facing numerically superior American forces. The psychological dimension of this asymmetry cannot be ignored. German crews entering combat in Normandy carried the weight of Germany's deteriorating strategic situation. They knew that the Allies had achieved overwhelming air superiority, that German cities were being systematically destroyed by strategic bombing, that the Eastern Front was consuming irreplaceable manpower and equipment. They knew that every tank lost would be difficult to replace, that casualties could not be made good, that time was working against Germany. This knowledge created a burden of expectation. Each engagement had to be decisive, each shot had to count, losses had to be minimized because there were no reserves to draw upon. American crews, while certainly not immune to fear and stress, operated within a framework of material abundance and strategic confidence. They knew that if their tank was destroyed, another would be available. If ammunition ran low, more would arrive. If they suffered casualties, replacements would fill the ranks. This difference in psychological framework shaped how crews approached combat. German crews fought with the desperation of men who knew they were being ground down by an enemy with inexhaustible resources. American crews, while certainly facing danger and death, fought with the confidence of men supported by the world's most powerful industrial economy. When German crews encountered the Sherman's rapid rate of fire, 4 or 5 rounds in the time it took them to fire twice, it reinforced their growing awareness that they were fighting not individual tanks, but an entire system designed to overwhelm German resistance through volume, persistence, and industrial capacity. The Sherman's automatic breach mechanism, its ergonomic ammunition storage, its reliable mechanical systems, all of these represented American industrial philosophy applied to warfare. And in the hedgerows of Normandy, that philosophy was proving devastatingly effective. German after-action reports from Normandy began noting these realities with increasing frequency. Unit commanders reported difficulties engaging American armor, noting the Sherman's ability to deliver sustained fire even when initially surprised. Crew testimonies described encounters where German tanks fired first, but were overwhelmed by volume of return fire before they could complete their reload cycle. Intelligence officers compiled these reports, analyzing patterns and attempting to develop counter-tactics. But the fundamental problem resisted tactical solutions. Germany simply lacked the industrial capacity to match American production, the logistical infrastructure to support sustained operations, or the manpower reserves to replace losses. The war had become a contest of systems rather than individual battles, and Germany's system was failing under the pressure of fighting enemies on multiple fronts, while its industrial base was systematically destroyed from the air. Lieutenant Behrman, recovering in a field hospital from burns suffered when his Panzer IV was destroyed, would have understood these realities intellectually, even if emotionally he struggled to accept them. He had been taught that German equipment, German training, German leadership would prevail. The evidence of his own experience standing helplessly beside a burning tank while American Shermans continued their relentless advance suggested otherwise. The war he had been prepared to fight was not the war he had actually fought. The assumptions about American capabilities that had informed his training had proved catastrophically incorrect, and as he would soon learn, his experience was being replicated across Normandy as German tank crews encountered an American way of warfare that their doctrine had not prepared them for. The Sherman's rate of fire was merely a symptom of a larger reality, that industrial capacity, properly applied, could overwhelm even the most technically sophisticated weapons and the most skilled crews. Private First Class Robert Whitley, loader on an M4A3 Sherman designated Cobra commander with the 2nd Armoured Division's 66th Armoured Regiment, had spent 9 weeks at Fort Knox learning his trade before shipping to England in February 1944. The training regime followed protocols outlined in Field Manual 17-12, Tank Gunnery, published in April 1943 by order of Chief of Staff George Marshall. The manual emphasized crew coordination above individual skill. Each crew member learned not only his own position, but the basics of every other crew station. Whitley could drive the Sherman if necessary, operate the radio, and even assist with gunnery. But his primary responsibility was keeping the 75mm gun fed with ammunition. The training focused relentlessly on speed and efficiency. Crew drill exercises required the loader to extract rounds from the ready rack, load them into the breech, and step clear in a continuous rhythm. The instructors at Fort Knox timed each loading cycle, demanding improvement until crews could maintain sustained fire at 12 to 15 rounds per minute. Whitley's crew achieved 18 rounds per minute during their qualification test, 1 round every 3.3 seconds. The automatic breech mechanism made this possible. When the gunner fired, the breech opened instantly, ejecting the spent casing. Whitley grabbed a round from the rack beside him, shoved it into the breech chamber, and stepped back. The breech closed automatically. The gunner could fire again within 2 to 4 seconds, depending on whether he needed to reacquire the target. This cycle continued until the ready rack was exhausted or the target was destroyed. The training manual made clear that crew survival depended on this efficiency. Section 5, Paragraph A stated, "Assign a permanent crew to each combat vehicle. Make the crews realize that their lives depend on it." The emphasis was not on heroics or individual marksmanship, but on teamwork and mechanical repetition. Each crew member had to function as part of an integrated system. The commander identified targets and gave fire commands. The gunner aimed and fired. The loader fed ammunition. The driver positioned the vehicle. The assistant driver operated the hull machine gun and passed ammunition forward when needed. When this system functioned properly, a Sherman crew could engage targets with devastating speed. When it broke down through poor coordination, panic, or mechanical failure, the crew died. Whitley's training included extensive live fire exercises using the ranges at Fort Knox. The Shermans fired at moving targets, stationary targets, and targets concealed behind obstacles. They practiced engaging multiple targets in rapid succession. They drilled on ammunition selection, armor-piercing rounds for enemy tanks, high-explosive shells for fortifications and soft targets, white phosphorus for marking and smoke screening. The loader had to identify ammunition types instantly by looking at the color-coded nose caps and base plates. Armor-piercing rounds had black tips with white markings. High-explosive shells had yellow noses. Smoke rounds were marked with red bands. In combat, selecting the wrong ammunition could mean the difference between destroying an enemy tank and merely annoying it. The physical layout of the Sherman's interior made rapid loading possible. The ready rack mounted on the turret floor held between 6 and 9 rounds depending on variant, positioned within easy reach of the loader's station. Additional ammunition was stored in racks along the hull walls and under the turret floor in water-jacketed containers. The wet stowage system, implemented in 1944, surrounded ammunition with water mixed with ethylene glycol to prevent fires if the tank was penetrated. This modification dramatically reduced the Sherman's vulnerability to catastrophic ammunition fires, though German crews would not learn of this improvement until encountering it in combat. The loader could access ready rounds without leaving his position, maintaining a continuous flow of ammunition to the gun even during violent maneuvering. By the time Whitley arrived in Normandy in late June 1944, he had loaded thousands of practice rounds. The motions were automatic, requiring no conscious thought. Grab, load, step clear, repeat. His hands bore calluses from handling the 30-pound shells hour after hour. His arms had developed the strength to maintain this pace through extended engagements. The training had transformed loading from a conscious activity, requiring focus and decision-making, into a reflexive motor pattern that functioned even under extreme stress. This was the intent of the training program, to create crews who could maintain fire, discipline, and mechanical efficiency, regardless of battlefield conditions. The alternative was death, and the Fort Knox instructors never let their students forget it. German tank crews received comparable training in their own doctrine, but the emphasis differed significantly. German gunnery training, conducted at facilities like the Panzer at Münster, stressed precision over volume. Crews learned to estimate range accurately using the excellent optics installed in German tanks. They practiced first-round hits at maximum effective range. The doctrine assumed that German tanks would engage enemy armor at distances where German guns could penetrate, but enemy guns could not, exploiting technical superiority to compensate for numerical inferiority. This worked well in many contexts, particularly on the Eastern Front where terrain allowed long-range engagements. But it left German crews unprepared for the volume of fire tactics that American crews would employ in Normandy's close terrain. The Panzer IV's manual loading system required different techniques than the Sherman's automatic breech. After firing, the German loader had to manually open the breech, extract the spent casing, stow it in a container to prevent it from rolling around the fighting compartment, select a new round from the ammunition storage, lift the round into position, guide it into the breech chamber, close the breech manually, and signal the gunner that the gun was loaded. This process required approximately 8 to 12 seconds under combat conditions, roughly twice as long as a trained Sherman crew needed. German crews could improve this time through practice and experience, but the mechanical realities of manual breech operation imposed limits that no amount of training could overcome. The system was reliable and proven, but it was not fast. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German training also emphasized individual tank capability over systemic advantage. A Tiger crew learned to position their tank to maximize the effectiveness of its 88mm gun and heavy armor. A Panther crew practiced using terrain to conceal their tank while maintaining sight lines for long-range engagement. The doctrine was fundamentally defensive. By 1944, used superior firepower and protection to destroy enemy tanks before they could close to effective range. This approach made perfect sense given Germany's strategic situation. Germany could not match Allied production. German tanks had to achieve favorable kill ratios just to maintain numerical parity. Every German tank destroyed was difficult to replace. Every Allied tank destroyed would be replaced within days. But this doctrine created psychological expectations that Normandy would violently disrupt. German crews expected to fire first, destroy enemy tanks at range, and relocate before return fire could be effective. They expected their superior optics to provide targeting advantages. They expected their heavier armor to protect them from enemy fire. These expectations were not unreasonable. They were based on successful experience on the Eastern Front and in North Africa, but they did not account for the American system of warfare that emphasized overwhelming firepower, mechanical reliability, and the integration of all available combat assets into a coordinated system designed to win through cumulative advantage rather than individual superiority. When German crews encountered this system in practice, the collision between expectation and reality proved psychologically devastating. The village of Cagny, 6 kilometers southeast of Cayenne, became the focal point of this collision during Operation Goodwood on July 18, 1944. British 8th Corps had launched the largest armoured offensive of the Normandy campaign, committing 3 armoured divisions, approximately 1,100 tanks, in an attempt to break through German defences and capture the WWII ridge beyond Cayenne. The offensive began with massive aerial bombardment. 927 Royal Air Force heavy bombers dropped over 6,800 tons of high explosives on German positions, creating a moonscape of craters and destroying much of the forward defensive zone. American medium bombers followed, adding fragmentation bombs designed to kill exposed infantry and gun crews. The bombardment was intended to stun German defenders and allow British armour to penetrate deep into German positions before organised resistance could form. Major Hans von Luck, commanding officer of Kampfgruppe von Luck from the 21st Panzer Division, observed the bombardment from a command post near Cagny. The village occupied tactically important high ground overlooking the approaches to WWII Ridge. Von Luck had positioned elements of his battle group to defend Cagny, including several 88mm anti-tank guns and at least one Tiger I heavy tank from the 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion. The bombing devastated forward positions, but von Luck's guns on the high ground near Cagny survived relatively intact, concealed in orchards and behind stone walls. As British armour advanced across the open ground, south of the Colombelles steelworks, von Luck's gunners waited, allowing the lead tanks to approach within effective range before opening fire. The engagement that followed demonstrated the divergence between British expectations and German defensive capability. British tank commanders had anticipated that the massive bombardment would suppress German anti-tank defences, allowing armour to advance rapidly across the supposedly cleared zone. Instead, as the lead tanks of the 23rd Hussars and the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment approached Cagny, von Luck's anti-tank guns opened fire with devastating effect. Within minutes, 16 British tanks were destroyed or disabled. The survivors pulled back, seeking cover in the cratered landscape left by the bombardment, but the German guns commanded the high ground and could engage targets across a wide arc. British tanks attempting to bypass Cagny to the east found themselves exposed to flanking fire. Those attempting to assault Cagny directly were engaged frontally at ranges where the 75mm Sherman gun struggled to penetrate German armour or destroy dug-in anti-tank positions. Von Luck later described the engagement in his memoirs, noting that German gunners understood they were exploiting a fundamental weakness in Allied tank design. The Sherman's thin armour and modest gun penetration made it vulnerable to German 88mm guns at ranges exceeding 1,200 metres distances, where return fire from Shermans was ineffective. The Tiger tank positioned near Cagny could engage British armour with near impunity. its frontal armor proof against 75mm fire, except at very close range or from advantageous angles. Von Luck estimated his battle group destroyed or damaged approximately 40 British tanks during the first hours of Operation Goodwood, temporarily halting the British advance and buying time for German reserves to move into defensive positions along Bourgebus Ridge. But von Luck also noted something that contradicted his expectations about Allied capabilities. The British tanks, despite suffering heavy losses, maintained their attack. Individual tanks were destroyed, but new tanks appeared to replace them. When one Sherman was knocked out, another maneuvered into firing position. The volume of fire directed at German positions was extraordinary shells, impacting continuously, forcing German gun crews to take cover, disrupting communications, preventing German tanks from relocating between firing positions. Von Luck had fought Soviet armor on the Eastern Front, where destroyed tanks were often not replaced for days or weeks. Here, British armor seemed inexhaustible. For every tank destroyed, 2 more appeared. This numerical pressure, combined with the constant threat of Allied air attack, meant that German forces could not maneuver in daylight without immediate detection and engagement. The engagement at Cagny was not decided by individual tank duels. Few such duels occurred in the classic sense of one tank engaging another at long range until one was destroyed. Instead, the battle dissolved into chaos where multiple factors determined outcomes. British tanks advanced across open ground, exposed to German fire. German anti-tank guns engaged from concealed positions. British artillery responded, suppressing German positions with high explosive shells. British tank destroyers, equipped with 17-pounder guns, moved forward to engage German armor at longer range. German infantry, armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, waited in cover for British tanks to approach. The result was not a clean engagement where technical superiority determined victor, but a confused melee where numbers, firepower, and the ability to absorb losses mattered more than individual tank quality. By the end of July 18th, British forces had advanced approximately 7 miles beyond their start lines, but had not achieved the breakthrough Operation Goodwood had intended. German defences along Bourgebus Ridge remained intact. British tank losses were severe. Estimates range from 314 to 400 tanks knocked out during 3 days of fighting, though many were later recovered and repaired. German losses were proportionally much lower, approximately 75 to 100 tanks destroyed. By conventional kill-to-loss ratios, German forces had won a tactical victory, but strategically the battle demonstrated a reality that German commanders were increasingly forced to acknowledge. Favorable kill ratios no longer mattered when the enemy possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than they occurred. Lieutenant Klaus Behrmann, recovering from burns in a field hospital after his Panzer IV was destroyed near Roré, learned of the Goodwood battle from other wounded tank crewmen who had participated in the defence. Their testimonies revealed a pattern. German tanks could destroy British armour at favourable ranges when conditions allowed. The Tiger and Panther were superior to the Sherman in armour protection and gun power. German crews were often more experienced than their Allied counterparts, particularly crews transferred from the Eastern Front. But none of these advantages could overcome the fundamental imbalance in resources and industrial capacity. British tanks kept coming. American tanks kept coming. German tanks, once destroyed, were not replaced. German crews, once killed, were replaced by hastily trained substitutes with minimal experience. One wounded Panther commander described an engagement south of Caen where his tank had destroyed 3 Shermans in rapid succession at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The Panther's long 75mm gun penetrated Sherman armor easily at that distance, but after destroying the 3rd Sherman, 6 more appeared. The Panther crew engaged again, destroying another Sherman. More Shermans appeared. The Panther, low on ammunition and unable to relocate due to engine problems, was eventually destroyed by a combination of artillery fire and a flanking attack by 2 Shermans firing white phosphorus shells that set the Panther ablaze. The crew bailed out, the commander suffering severe burns. He told Behrmann that the engagement illustrated what German crews were increasingly facing: tactical success, leading to strategic defeat, because Allied forces could absorb losses indefinitely while German forces could not. Another crew described an encounter where their Tiger had engaged a column of British armour at maximum range, destroying the lead tank and forcing the column to halt. The Tiger crew fired methodically, destroying or damaging several more tanks before Allied artillery began ranging in on their position. The Tiger relocated, but Allied fighter bombers appeared within minutes, forcing the crew to abandon their tank and take cover. The Tiger survived the air attack, but could not relocate in daylight without being spotted and engaged. That night, the crew attempted to drive the Tiger to a new position but encountered mechanical problems. The Tiger's chronic final drive failures made it unreliable for sustained operations. The crew eventually abandoned the Tiger and withdrew on foot, joining infantry units defending nearby villages. The Tiger was later destroyed by British engineers to prevent its recapture. The crew survived but lost their vehicle not to enemy action, but to mechanical failure compounded by inability to repair it under battlefield conditions. These testimonies revealed a pattern that Bearman found deeply troubling. German technical superiority, real and measurable, was being negated by Allied material superiority and systematic application of overwhelming force. German tanks could win individual engagements but could not win campaigns because the cumulative effect of attrition favoured the side that could replace losses. This was not the war German crews had been trained to fight. This was industrial warfare where mathematics trumped skill, where production capacity determined outcomes more than tactical prowess, where the ability to keep tanks operational mattered more than the power of their guns. And Germany, by mid-1944, was losing this contest decisively. The turning point for many German tank crews came not in dramatic battlefield encounters, but in quieter moments of realization when accumulated evidence could no longer be rationalized away. For Bearman, this moment occurred in the field hospital as he listened to testimony after testimony describing the same pattern. German tanks destroyed Allied armour at favourable ratios. German crews fought with skill and determination, but Allied tanks kept appearing, kept attacking, kept pushing forward regardless of losses. The mathematics were inescapable. If Germany destroyed 3 Allied tanks for every German tank lost, a ratio German forces actually achieved in many Normandy engagements, but Allied forces could field 10 tanks for every German tank, then favourable kill ratios merely slowed rather than prevented defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.